Westminster Abbey held 2,000 guests that Saturday morning, its nave stretching 412 feet from west door to high altar, its stone columns rising 15 stories above the heads of prime ministers, foreign royals, and the Archbishop of Canterbury, who had been rehearsing for months. The Diamond Jubilee State Coach had carried Charles and Camilla down the Mall through gray spring light, its gilded panels catching whatever sun broke through the clouds. Inside the Abbey, the ceremony moved through its ancient sequence: anointing, investiture, crowning. The same order of service performed in that same building, at that same altar, for 1,000 years. When the Archbishop lifted Queen Mary's crown above Camilla's head, paused for the fraction of a second that makes it onto every front page, and lowered it into place, the image that went around the world was specific and still. Camilla, 75 years old, sitting perfectly motionless under a crown made in 1911, while Charles sat a few feet away in the Imperial State Crown, his coronation ring on his finger, the whole ceremony resolving into its formal tableau. The choir sang, the ancient liturgy continued. Westminster Abbey's stone geometry held the moment. Millions of people watching felt something land in their chest that most of them hadn't quite anticipated, even knowing it was coming. YouGov polling from around the coronation period showed Camilla's approval profile split roughly in half. Popularity in the mid to upper 30%, a comparable proportion reporting an unfavorable view. Nearly 30 years after the worst of the public condemnation, after every official accommodation, every stage of an extraordinarily well-documented rehabilitation campaign, the numbers still hadn't converged. The country watched the crown descend. A significant portion of it felt the same thing it had been feeling since 1997. Some called it betrayal. Others described something more physical, a revulsion that sat in the body rather than the mind, difficult to explain to anyone who hadn't lived through the original events. This is the story of why that feeling exists, what the documented record actually shows when you lay the timeline flat, and why no formal endorsement has ever fully settled it. It begins not in 2023 and not in jewelry, but in the early 1970s, with two people who probably should have been allowed to stay together and weren't. Camilla Shand was 23 years old when she met Charles, around 1970 or 1971. She was moving through the same upper-class English social world as the Prince of Wales: polo grounds at Windsor Great Park, country house weekends in Wiltshire, evenings at Annabelle's in Berkeley Square. According to Penny Junor's biography, they were formally introduced by a mutual friend named Lucia Santa Cruz, who made a joke about their shared genetic history. Alice Keppel, Camilla's great-grandmother, had been a long-term mistress of King Edward VII. The ancestral echo was pointed and would prove prophetic in ways nobody in that room was yet imagining. They spent months together attending polo matches at Smith's Lawn, at the private dinners that punctuate that kind of life, establishing the easy intimacy of two people who want roughly the same things and exist in close enough proximity for that wanting to become real. Giles Brandreth's account describes their social world with precision. It was upper-class, well-staffed, conservative garden party England, and within that world, Charles and Camilla fitted together naturally, in a way that his subsequent choices would never quite reproduce. Then Charles departed for 6 months of Royal Navy duties in early 1973. He left without asking her to wait. 4 months later, Camilla announced her engagement to Andrew Parker Bowles, a guards officer she had been seeing on and off since the late 1960s, who had also, briefly, been seen with Princess Anne. The wedding took place on July 4, 1973, at the Guards Chapel in Wellington Barracks, a Catholic ceremony, 800 guests, described in the press as the Society Wedding of the Year. Queen Elizabeth II's daughter Anne attended. So did Princess Margaret and the Queen Mother. In a letter written after the engagement was announced, Charles described the end of a blissful, peaceful, and mutually happy relationship as particularly cruel. He reportedly made a last-ditch attempt to stop the wedding. She married Parker Bowles anyway, moved to Wiltshire, and had 2 children, Tom in 1974, Laura in 1978. The friendship continued regardless. By 1978, or perhaps slightly earlier, Charles and Camilla had resumed their romantic involvement. Both were still married to other people. Andrew Parker Bowles was reportedly aware and indifferent. He had interests of his own outside the marriage. Charles had leaned heavily on Camilla after Lord Mountbatten was assassinated by the Provisional IRA in August 1979. The affair ran as an undercurrent through the late 1970s, visible to their immediate social circle, even when invisible to the country. Multiple royal biographers confirm the rekindled relationship had happened by 1980. Then Charles began pursuing Diana Spencer. Lady Diana Spencer was 19 when Charles proposed to her at Windsor Castle on February 6, 1981. She was an aristocrat with an immaculate pedigree, young, uncontroversial, untouched by scandal. Exactly what the palace's more conservative institutional wing had been hoping Charles would eventually choose. The engagement was announced. The country lit up. The tabloids ran photographs of her blushing outside her flat, her kindergarten behind her. Already the fairy tale the press had been waiting to write. 2 weeks before the wedding, Diana found the bracelet. Charles had arranged for it to be delivered to Camilla. An engraved gold chain bearing the initials F and G for Fred and Gladys, the private nicknames Charles and Camilla used for each other. Diana saw it among the parcels waiting for delivery before the wedding. She described the discovery in detail on the recordings she made for Andrew Morton. "Devastating," she said. She went to friends who confirmed what she suspected. She confronted Charles. He didn't deny it. She went to the wedding anyway. The wedding itself took place on July 29, 1981, at St. Paul's Cathedral. The dress, designed by David and Elizabeth Emanuel, 25 feet of ivory silk taffeta with a 10,000 sequin train, was one of the most scrutinized garments in modern history, before it even appeared on the steps of the cathedral. An estimated 750 million people watched the broadcast worldwide. Diana was 20 years old. The crowds lining the route from Buckingham Palace stretched far enough that people standing at the back could hear the roar moving along the street before they could see the carriage. Church bells, August light, the whole orchestrated machinery of royal ceremony at its most intact. On the honeymoon, Diana opened Charles's diary. 2 photographs of Camilla Parker Bowles fell from the pages. She also noticed the cufflinks he was wearing. Gold, engraved with 2 intertwined C's. A gift from Camilla. Not from his new wife, not from his family, from Camilla. Diana recorded this herself, on tape, in her own voice, for the book that would eventually become Diana, Her True Story. These details aren't tabloid inference or source close to the family speculation. They come from Diana's own testimony, preserved on audio cassettes that Andrew Morton received through an intermediary and kept secret for years. When the tapes were eventually released, they confirmed what the 1992 book had already put into print. Diana remained composed in public. She was extraordinarily good at that. The cameras saw what the cameras were meant to see. On state occasions, at charity visits, in the photographs that made her one of the most recognizable faces on the planet, she wore the institution's jewelry beautifully and carried herself with a formality the palace couldn't have trained if they'd tried. In 1985, at the White House, she danced with John Travolta in a midnight blue velvet gown while wearing a 7-strand pearl choker with a sapphire and diamond clasp, a piece originally gifted to her by Queen Elizabeth II as a brooch which Diana had converted into the choker that would become one of her most iconic accessories. The image of that dance went everywhere. She wore the same choker to the Serpentine Gallery 9 years later, and the context of that second wearing would become one of the most pointed statements of her life. In 1985, on the Australian tour, she wore an Art Deco emerald choker as a headband. She was 24 years old. The photographs became famous not just for what she was wearing, but for what the wearing communicated. A confidence with royal jewelry that felt spontaneous rather than ceremonial, personal rather than institutional. She was very beautiful. She understood what she was doing. Multiple sources confirm that Charles and Camilla stopped being lovers between 1981 and 1986. The marriage had its functional years. Good periods existed alongside the difficult ones. William was born in June 1982, Harry in September 1984. The biography, Camilla, From Outcast to Queen Consort, states the affair was genuinely paused during these years, and Diana confirmed this chronology herself. She told Martin Bashir in 1995 that 1986 was the year Charles turned back to Camilla. So the marriage had at least a few years of something like itself. The affair wasn't continuous through the entire marriage. But what happened in 1986 happened while Harry was 2 years old and William was 4, while Diana was 25 and doing her best in a role that the institution had built no real infrastructure to support. Then, 1986. According to Jonathan Dimbleby's authorized biography of Charles, the book the Prince of Wales himself cooperated with, providing 180 hours of interview footage over the course of 2 years, the affair resumed in 1986. Dimbleby had full access. The resulting book named 1986 as the documented date when Charles and Camilla resumed their relationship. Diana confirmed the same date in her Panorama interview. The authorized biography and the wife's own testimony align on the same year. That's not a contested detail. The 1989 birthday party in Gloucestershire has entered a particular kind of documented folklore. Diana had found out the affair had resumed. She'd become aware of a pattern of phone calls, of absences that mapped to Camilla's location, of the persistent presence she'd long suspected, but could now no longer tell herself was a friendship within normal bounds. She described her emotional state in the Morton recordings as resolved rather than distressed. She had decided what she was going to do. The party was at a country house. Camilla was there. Diana told Morton that she found Camilla in the basement and decided in that moment to walk directly over rather than circulate away. What she described in the Morton tapes was her own delivery. Calm, she said, deathly calm. Walking up to the woman who had been there throughout and telling her directly, "I know what's going on between you and Charles, and I just want you to know that." Then she named what she felt as she said it. She told Camilla she was sorry to be in the way, that she obviously was in the way, that it must be hell for both of them, but that she wasn't an idiot, and she wasn't going to pretend she didn't see what was in front of her. She went home that night. She wrote in the Morton account that she cried and cried and cried. The Camillagate tape, a recording of an intimate telephone conversation between Charles and Camilla, made in 1989 during the same period, was published as a transcript in a British tabloid in January 1993. The conversation left nothing ambiguous about the nature of their relationship. Its publication followed Andrew Morton's Diana, Her True Story by 6 months, and the two documents arriving in sequence, the book in June 1992, the tape transcript in January 1993, functioned together as a kind of accumulated case that the country absorbed over the course of 8 months. Prime Minister John Major had already announced the formal separation in the House of Commons in December 1992. By early 1993, the separation had a paper trail. June 29, 1994, was a Wednesday. Charles sat across from Jonathan Dimbleby in a 2.5-hour documentary that aired on ITV under the title Charles, the Private Man, the Public Role. The program had been in production for 2 years. 180 hours of footage had been recorded. What eventually went to air covered Charles's charitable interests, his views on architecture and the built environment, his religious faith, his relationship with his sons, the profile of a future king attempting to establish himself as a serious public figure rather than a tabloid subject. According to Radio Times, more than 23 million people watched. Prince Philip, reportedly, was among them and was said to have been outraged. Most of the program was exactly what it said it was, a documentary about a man's public work. Then Dimbleby arrived at the question. He asked Charles whether he had tried to be faithful and honorable to Princess Diana during the marriage. "Yes, absolutely," Charles replied. Dimbleby pressed, "And you were?" The pause before Charles spoke has been described in contemporaneous press accounts as lasting several seconds. Then, "Yes, until it became irretrievably broken down, us both having tried." He didn't name Camilla Parker Bowles during the program. He called her a dear friend and a friend for a very long time, who would continue to be a friend for a very long time. The next morning, his private secretary, Richard Aylard, held a press conference and confirmed, for anyone who had somehow missed it, that the woman in question was Camilla Parker Bowles. A telephone poll conducted by The Sun found that 2/3 of those who rang in believed Charles was no longer fit to be king. The Guardian said the documentary stunned the nation. Alan Hamilton in The Times wrote that the admission had been set amid great cushions of sympathetic patting, as though the surrounding 2 hours of earnest public service footage could soften what those 8 words in the middle of the film had made irrevocable. That same evening, Diana appeared at the Serpentine Gallery in Hyde Park for a charity event she had committed to attending. The dress she wore, black, off-the-shoulder, short, designed by Christina Stambolian, wasn't the dress anyone had expected her to wear. She had been photographed in the dress before, had reportedly rejected it for earlier occasions as too bold. She wore it that night, the evening of her husband's public confession, and it became known immediately and permanently as the revenge dress. Every photograph from that event carries a double exposure, the dress and the context. Around her neck, the 7-strand pearl choker with the sapphire and diamond clasp, the same piece she'd worn at the White House in 1985, the same piece that had come to her as a brooch from Queen Elizabeth II. She was 32 years old. She had found out that morning, along with 23 million other people, that her husband's public position on his fidelity was, until it became irretrievably broken down. She wore the choker that had become one of her signatures and walked directly into the cameras and smiled. If that's not a statement, nothing is. In December 1994, 5 months after the Dimbleby interview aired, Camilla filed for divorce from Andrew Parker Bowles. The divorce was finalized on March 3, 1995. Multiple sources, including the biography Camilla, From Outcast to Queen Consort, identify Charles's public confession as the catalyst that made the divorce viable. Camilla reportedly had not wanted Charles to discuss their affair publicly. He wanted to. He did. She then filed within months of the broadcast. The sequence is documented, the dates are confirmed, and the causality that the sources suggest follows clearly from the chronology. In November 1995, Diana sat down with BBC journalist Martin Bashir at Kensington Palace. The interview was broadcast on November 20th, 1995. 54 minutes, BBC One, an audience that numbered tens of millions. She had prepared for it carefully. The interview was, by multiple accounts, her deliberate response to the Dimbleby documentary the year before. Charles had told his story on national television, and she had decided to tell hers. She spoke about loneliness, about an institution that had responded to her difficulties by treating them as problems of perception rather than substance. She spoke about eating disorders and about self-harm. She spoke with startling directness for a woman who had spent 15 years inside an institution built on discretion, about the specific texture of what her marriage had felt like from the inside. She also acknowledged, in the same interview, that she had found solace in a friendship of her own during the marriage. The picture she drew wasn't of a simple wronged innocent and a clear villain. It was of a marriage destroyed by accumulating weight and by a specific, documented third presence that had never fully departed. And then she delivered the line. 11 words, in response to Bashir's question about whether the presence of a third party had damaged the marriage. Well, there were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded. Nobody needed it explained. The country had had nearly a decade to accumulate the context that gave those 11 words their weight. 1986, 1989, 1992, 1993, 1994. The line arrived at the end of a long, documented sequence and compressed it into a sentence that required no footnotes. Diana and Charles's divorce was finalized in August 1996. 1 year after that, on August 31st, 1997, Princess Diana died in a car accident in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel in Paris. She was 36 years old. William was 15. Harry was 12. The public response, the flowers, the cues, the visible breakdown of whatever emotional regulation ordinarily operates at scale, was something that surprised even those who had watched Diana's public role develop over 16 years. The grief was enormous and immediate, and a significant portion of it immediately converted into something harder, directed at the circumstances and the people who had contributed to the marriage's destruction. Now lay the timeline flat and read it once. 1970, Charles meets Camilla. 1973, Camilla marries Andrew Parker Bowles. Charles reportedly makes a last-ditch attempt to stop the wedding. 1978, the affair resumes, both parties still married to other people. 1981, Charles marries Diana. Diana finds the bracelet, initials F and G. On the honeymoon, photographs of Camilla fall from his diary. He wears cufflinks Camilla gave him. 1986, the affair resumes again, documented in Charles's own authorized biography. 2 sons in the house. Diana is 25. 1989, Diana confronts Camilla at a party. "Deathly calm," she said. The Camilla Gate tape is recorded the same year. 1992, John Major announces the separation from the floor of the House of Commons. 1994, Charles admits the affair on national television. 23 million viewers. The revenge dress, the same evening. 1995, Diana tells the country there were 3 of them in the marriage. Camilla files for divorce. 1997, Diana dies at 36. 2005, Charles marries Camilla at Windsor Guildhall. 2023, Camilla is crowned Queen at Westminster Abbey. The dates make the argument. They always did. Now to the jewels. And something honest needs to be said here before anything else. When people see Camilla wearing royal jewelry and call it Diana's, they aren't making a legal claim. The royal collection doesn't belong to any individual. It belongs to the crown as an institution, held in trust for the nation. And it has been accessible to every queen consort in modern history. Queen Mary wore it. The Queen Mother wore it. Queen Elizabeth II wore it for 70 years. The practice of a queen consort drawing on the collection for state occasions predates everyone alive. But what people mean when they say Diana's jewels is something more specific and more human than legal ownership structures can contain. They mean Diana wore these. She wore them as part of the crown she had married into, the institution she had given her youth to, while Camilla Parker Bowles was quietly present throughout the destruction of what Diana had believed she was building when she stood at the front of St. Paul's Cathedral at 20 years old, in front of 750 million people. Camilla now wears the same institutional inheritance. That's the wound. The accuracy of the ownership paperwork doesn't close it. At the May 6th coronation, Camilla wore Queen Mary's crown, made in 1911, modified for the occasion with 4 of its 8 arches removed, and 3 Cullinan diamonds added specifically as a tribute to Queen Elizabeth II. The Cullinan III, a 94.4 carat pear-shaped diamond, was placed at the crown's apex. The Cullinan IV sat at the crown's base. The Cullinan V, heart-shaped, replaced the Koh-i-Noor diamond's original position, a deliberate reordering that the palace framed as honoring Elizabeth rather than sidestepping the colonial history of the original stone. She also wore the coronation necklace, made in 1858 for Queen Victoria, featuring 25 graduated brilliant diamonds and a 22.48-carat Lahore diamond pendant, worn by every queen consort at every coronation since Queen Alexandra wore it in 1902. The necklace was worn by Queen Mary in 1911, the Queen Mother in 1937, Queen Elizabeth II in 1953, and now Camilla in 2023. She wore her own personal diamond drop earrings, a large round diamond in a modern gold setting, seen previously at a state dinner in Athens in March 2021, rather than the ceremonial coronation earrings, because Camilla doesn't have pierced ears. The coronation earrings, therefore, remained in their case. None of the specific coronation pieces were Diana's. Diana never held the role of queen consort, and so never wore the coronation regalia. This needs to be stated plainly rather than elided. The pieces Camilla has worn in the years since the coronation tell a more specific and more emotionally loaded story. On November 3, 2024, at the state banquet for the Emir of Qatar, she wore the Kakashnik tiara, a shimmering diamond tiara dating to the 19th century, inherited by Queen Elizabeth II from Queen Alexandra, and worn by the late queen at state banquets across her 70-year reign. Most recently photographed on her at a state visit to Turkey in May 2008. The same diamonds, the same setting, the same head ornament, now on Camilla's head, at the same kind of event, in the same rooms. At a reception and dinner at Mansion House in October 2023, Camilla wore the Girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara, a piece Queen Elizabeth II had worn from the early 1950s, when she was still Princess Elizabeth, through to the final years of her reign. In November 2023, at a royal ballet performance at Covent Garden, Camilla wore a small pendant set with diamonds, pink topazes, and sapphires. Buckingham Palace confirmed, in the brief they issued to reporters that evening, that the pendant had belonged to Queen Elizabeth II. A royal jewelry account subsequently identified a 1936 photograph of the young Princess Elizabeth wearing that same pendant. The future queen, photographed by Marcus Adams, wearing it as a 10-year-old. The image was published in the Souvenir Coronation program in 1937. The same pendant is now part of Camilla's rotation. At the diplomatic reception at Buckingham Palace in December 2023, Camilla appeared in an enormous diamond stomacher from the collection of Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, a piece from the Greville bequest, confirmed by Buckingham Palace. The corsage ornament features ribbon and tassel detailing and is, by any assessment, one of the more visually spectacular pieces in the entire collection. These are Queen Elizabeth II's jewels. And Queen Elizabeth II was the same woman who bore witness to everything that happened during her son's marriage, who managed the institution through Diana's death, through the years of public grief, through the slow and carefully staged rehabilitation campaign that moved Camilla from national pariah to the woman sitting next to the king at every state occasion. That same queen, wearing all of those years of knowledge, issued a formal statement on February 6, 2022, the 70th anniversary of her own accession, saying it was her sincere wish that Camilla would be known as Queen Consort, the most significant possible endorsement on the most significant possible date of her reign, given by a woman who knew everything and had decided that the institution's continuity required a settled answer. Millions of people made no equivalent decision. Diana's personal jewelry, the pieces associated with her rather than with the crown as an institution, sits predominantly with William and Catherine. The 12-carat Ceylon sapphire engagement ring, surrounded by 25 cushion-cut diamonds, was William's deliberate choice when he proposed to Catherine in 2010. He had kept the ring after his mother's death. Giving it to Catherine was understood, immediately and universally, as a tribute. This ring on this woman's hand is a statement about continuity. The piece that carries the most documented, visually unmistakable connection between Diana and the royal collection is the Cambridge Lover's Knot tiara, made around 1818, worn by Queen Mary, loaned to Diana by Queen Elizabeth II in 1981 as a wedding gift. Diana chose the Spencer family tiara for the actual wedding ceremony, but what she went on to wear publicly, repeatedly, in photographs that burned themselves into the public visual memory of who Diana was the Cambridge Lover's Knot. She wore it at the state opening of Parliament in 1981. She wore it at King Constantine's dinner on July 11, 1986, alongside sapphire and diamond earrings, in photographs that circulated worldwide. She wore it across more than a decade of public life, until the tiara and her face became associated with each other in the way that only sustained repetition achieves. Camilla doesn't wear the Cambridge Lover's Knot tiara. She reportedly stays well clear of it. Catherine, Princess of Wales, wears it. She wore it to the Nigerian state banquet, confirmed across multiple sources. The tiara described in contemporaneous coverage as most famously associated with Diana because of how often she wore it. She wore it alongside the Greville diamond chandelier earrings, which belonged to Queen Elizabeth II, at a Windsor state dinner. The combination of Diana's signature tiara and the late Queen's earrings assembled on the same head at the same event. At the Trump state banquet, confirmed by WWD, Catherine wore Diana's tiara alongside Diana's jewelry. At the German state visit, confirmed by Town & Country, Diana's earrings again. At a recent state banquet, Good Housekeeping UK reported that Catherine wore Princess Diana's tiara, her first time wearing one in 2 years. The occasion noted precisely because the choice carried meaning. The pearl choker with the sapphire clasp, the piece Diana wore at the White House with John Travolta in 1985, the piece she wore on the night of the revenge dress in 1994, the piece originally given to her by Queen Elizabeth II, is documented by InStyle as now in use by Catherine, in the same way it was in use by Princess Diana, by Queen Alexandra, and by Queen Mary. The chain of custody runs through the Crown institution. The emotional resonance runs through the women who wore it, and what was happening in their lives when they chose it. The Greville chandelier earrings from Queen Elizabeth II's collection go to Catherine rather than Camilla. Camilla's ears are unpierced. The logistics of biology have contributed to the distribution the public wanted to see. At the 2023 coronation, Catherine wore Diana's pearl and diamond earrings. Camilla wore her own personal diamond drops. The pieces most closely associated with Diana ended up on Diana's daughter-in-law. The institutional math resolved through a combination of William's deliberate choices, Catherine's own instincts, and what appears to be Camilla's awareness of which comparisons would be most difficult to weather, in roughly the direction that millions of people had hoped it would. The Spectator, covering Catherine's growing public prominence, described her explicitly as the next people's princess, naming the tribute rather than eliding it. The phrase people's princess was Tony Blair's from the morning of August 31st, 1997. To use it again in 2023 and apply it to Catherine is to draw a direct line forward from Diana's death. Princess Charlotte was born May 2nd, 2015. She is currently 5th in line to the throne, behind Charles, William, George, and Louis. She is 10 years old. She wears the same bow from her mother's wardrobe, sits in the same pew at the same church services, appears in the same family photographs that have been taken since she was old enough to stand. She exists within the household William and Catherine have shaped in conscious tribute to Diana, growing up in the knowledge of what her grandmother was and what Diana meant to the people who loved her. The pieces she'll eventually wear, the Cambridge lover's knot, the pearl choker, the earrings from the White House evening, the engagement ring currently on her mother's hand, are decades away from her hands. But they'll arrive. That's the long arithmetic the people who love Diana are running in the background. The depth of public feeling has never been a social media niche. It's documented, persistent, and measurable across decades. In the immediate aftermath of Diana's death in August 1997, Camilla Parker Bowles became what journalist Jordan Baker, writing in The Age in 2024, described as reaching the depths of opprobrium. The tabloid vocabulary from that period, horseface, old trout, frump, was mild compared to informal circulation. The title of Baker's piece told the full arc in 2 clauses, from horseface to Britain's grandmother. How Queen Camilla won over a skeptical public. Except that the winning over, measured by actual polling data, remains unfinished. The Rehabilitation campaign, documented by The Age as Operation PB, described as the anatomy of a royal PR campaign, moved through a series of calculated steps across a decade. First public appearance as a couple, January 28, 1999, leaving a party at the Ritz Hotel in London, approximately 200 photographers and reporters outside. One account gives the number as 200. Whatever the exact count, the crowd itself was the statement. Every outlet in the world was watching this couple take 20 steps across a pavement together. Then the incremental royal family accommodations. Queen Elizabeth attending a party at Camilla's Wiltshire home in 2002. The first informal public signal of acceptance, carefully noted by every royal correspondent in the country. Camilla moving into Clarence's house with Charles in August 2003. Accompanying Charles to the annual Highland Games in Scotland in 2004. The engagement announced February 10, 2005. The civil wedding at Windsor Guildhall on April 9, 2005. Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip absent from the ceremony itself, present only at the Anglican blessing in St. George's Chapel, and the reception afterward. William and Harry issued a statement. They were very happy for our father and Camilla, and we wish them all the luck in the future. Luck. Not joy, not happiness. Luck. The word you reach for when what you feel is too complicated to name and too public to explain. The strategy worked in measurable terms. YouGov polling in the days following Queen Elizabeth II's death in September 2022 found 63% of those polled supported Camilla becoming queen consort. The improvement from near total condemnation in 1997 to majority acceptance in 2022 represents an extraordinary amount of institutional effort, and it still lands well short of the place in public affection that a more straightforwardly obtained crown might occupy. By January 2026, Statista data showed 42% of British people holding a positive opinion of Camilla, 45% reporting a negative view. After everything, after the decades of careful management, the endorsed succession, the coronation itself, the negative number slightly exceeds the positive one. Tina Brown, former editor of Vanity Fair and author of the Palace Papers, put her finger on what was driving Camilla's persistence through the worst years. Saving the suffering prince had now become her mission. There is no other explanation for how else Camilla could have tolerated the successive humiliations that rained down on her in the mid-1990s. Brown's framing positions Camilla as a woman who stayed because she loved Charles, not because she was calculating a path to the throne. That may be entirely accurate. It doesn't change what the staying cost Diana, or what the love story's institutional resolution looks like from outside it. The comment sections and social media threads where Diana's supporters gather, documented across Reddit, YouTube, and platform communities, tend to cluster around the same language, the same registers. Betrayal, something physical and involuntary, a wrongness that arrives before any articulate reason for it does. The word ill. The word vomit. Words for what the body does when the mind presents it with something it is categorized as a violation. This isn't a small demographic. The YouGov numbers show it spanning a substantial portion of the population, across age groups, across more than a generation of continued relevance. The persistent negative sentiment exists because rehabilitation isn't absolution, and absolution was never actually on offer. The documented facts of the affair aren't disputed by anyone. Charles admitted them on national television, in front of 23 million viewers, using language precise enough that his private secretary had to hold a separate press conference the following morning to name the specific person. The country watched that admission in 1994. Many of them watched Diana's response to it the following year. Many of them watched her funeral in 1997. And many of them watched the Archbishop of Canterbury lower Queen Mary's crown onto Camilla's head in 2023, and felt all three of those events arrive simultaneously. The standard institutional defense of all of this is both honest and brief. The king's wife wears the king's jewels. That's the rule. It has been the rule for centuries, and Queen Elizabeth II made her personal endorsement explicit on February 6, 2022, stating it was her sincere wish that Camilla be known as Queen Consort. The late Queen's statement was unambiguous, issued on the most weighted date of her calendar, backed by the full authority of a 70-year reign. The rule is real. The precedent is consistent. The most beloved British monarch of the modern era personally confirmed the succession. That's the strongest possible institutional argument, and it deserves to be stated accurately before anything else is said. But protocol answers a constitutional question. The people who feel physically ill when the photographs appear are asking a moral one. Those are different questions, and no formal endorsement, however sincere, however carefully timed, bridges them. The rules about who wears what in a succession were written for succession. They weren't written to account for a specific sequence in which the king's wife was the undocumented presence throughout the destruction of his first marriage, while that first wife wore many of the same pieces from the same collection, and in doing so, gave those pieces an emotional history the institution had no framework for managing. Protocol doesn't know about the bracelet with the F and the G. It doesn't know about the diary on the honeymoon, or about Diana going home from the 1989 party and crying until she couldn't. It processes the role, not the history of how the role was reached. Grief questions and protocol questions are answered in different courts. The feeling that settles over a substantial portion of the population when a photograph of Camilla in royal jewelry circulates isn't going to be resolved by a statement about institutional custom, however authoritative. It was never that kind of question. Catherine, Princess of Wales, is 30 years younger than Camilla. She'll be wearing the pieces most closely associated with Diana's memory: the Cambridge lover's knot, the pearl choker, the earrings from every documented occasion, for decades after Camilla has attended her last state banquet. That's the arithmetic the people who love Diana are carrying when they express hope that the legacy will outlast the current reign. The Cambridge lover's knot at the Nigerian state banquet, Diana's pearl and diamond earrings at the May 2023 coronation, on the day Camilla was crowned. Diana's engagement ring, worn every day, chosen by William deliberately when he was 28 years old and sitting in a tent in Kenya and deciding what kind of proposal he wanted to make. Diana's pearl choker with the sapphire clasp, the same piece from the White House in 1985 and the Serpentine Gallery in 1994, now in Catherine's hands, documented as passing from Diana to Catherine through the chain the InStyle article traced. In the same way it was in use by Princess Diana, by Queen Alexandra, and by Queen Mary. The Spectator called Catherine the next people's princess explicitly, naming the tribute, not softening it, invoking Blair's phrase from the morning of Diana's death and attaching it to the woman who wears Diana's ring and Diana's tiara and Diana's choker, and who is raising Diana's grandchildren in a household shaped, visibly and deliberately, in tribute to who Diana was. Princess Charlotte is 10 years old. She is 5th in line to the throne. She has decades ahead of her, and within those decades are the state banquets and the official portraits and the photographs that will eventually generate their own archive. The pieces that have passed from Diana to Catherine will in time pass further. The Cambridge lover's knot was worn by Queen Mary, loaned to Diana, and is now Catherine's. When it eventually reaches Charlotte, and the mathematics of succession suggest it will carry all of that history in its setting. Every generation of women in that family who wore it, and what was happening in their lives when they chose it. The hope people express about Charlotte isn't sentimental. It's specific and forward-facing, anchored in the actual trajectory of these actual pieces through these actual hands. Diana's story doesn't end in the Pont de l'Anma tunnel. It lives in the ring on Catherine's hand at every engagement she attends, in the tiara at the Nigerian state banquet, in the earrings at the Trump state dinner. It will live in Charlotte's photographs, in 20 years or 30, in whichever tiara she selects for whichever occasion becomes the one everyone remembers. That's a longer horizon than Camilla's reign. The people who love Diana understand this, and it's part of why they're still watching. Westminster Abbey, May 6, 2023. Queen Mary's crown, modified for the occasion with 4 arches removed and 3 Cullinan diamonds added in explicit tribute to Queen Elizabeth II, was lowered onto Camilla's head by the Archbishop of Canterbury. The ceremony was complete. Decades of rehabilitation had arrived at their institutional destination. The protocol had been followed precisely. The rule had been applied consistently. The late Queen's explicit endorsement had given the whole sequence the authority of the most admired monarchy in the modern era. And still, when the photographs circulated in the hours and days after, Camilla on the Buckingham Palace balcony, Camilla in the state coach, Camilla in post-coronation coverage beside the king, the same portion of the public that had always felt this way felt it again, immediately, without being prompted, without needing the tabloids to frame it for them. Because the feeling isn't about the jewelry. The jewelry is the occasion, not the cause. The cause is that Diana said there were 3 of them in the marriage. She said it on camera, on BBC One, broadcast on November 20th, 1995, to an audience of tens of millions. She was 34 years old. She had 2 sons. She compressed 11 years of damage into 11 words, and the people who heard those words have carried them across 3 decades, through the divorce, through the death in Paris, through Operation PB and the Ritz Hotel photographs, and the Windsor Guildhall civil ceremony, and the Platinum Jubilee statement, and the coronation. The crown is Camilla's to wear now. The protocol is real, the precedent is consistent, and the endorsement was given by a queen who knew everything and chose the institution's continuity anyway. The feeling is also real. It was documented before the coronation and documented after it, and it persists because the timeline that produced this outcome was documented too, in Charles's own voice on an ITV documentary in June 1994, in Diana's voice the November following, in every year between 1986 and 1997 that the marriage absorbed and that the marriage eventually couldn't survive. Nobody is told how to feel. The dates have always done that work on their own. Subscribe for more stories like this.